Hey, how you doing? This is RJ. So before I begin today, I just want to remind everyone that the link is in the description for the Indiegogo pre-launch page for my coming graphic novel. And if you go to the pre-launch page, you can take a look at some of the art for this graphic novel and watch the video that I did this week that shows you a little bit of the interior art and talks about the story, which my elevator pitch for this story is a combination of 2 parts 1980s X-Men, 1 part 1980s Justice League of America, and 1 part Ocean's 11. I want to bring back to life a traditional hero story, a traditional high adventure of comics, and give it some class and intrigue like Ocean's 11. So if you go to the pre-launch page and leave your email address, you will be informed when the book goes live. And also, if you sign up and then later order the book, you will receive a free pinup poster with your book. And the only place that you can get this specific pinup poster is by leaving your email address so that you will be informed when the project goes live. It will not be available anywhere else. Alright, so that out of the way, I want to talk about another Marvel podcast that I listened to over the last week. Now, I'll put the link in the description for this podcast in case you wish to go listen to it. But it's about Halloween, so it's a couple of weeks old, and about horror comics. And a lot of people ask me, why do I listen to these things to begin with? Well, I think it's actually fascinating to listen to these quote-unquote progressive people speak to each other in a way where they have their guard down. It is a fascinating view into the minds of these people and why they do what they do. But before I get into any of that, I want to talk about my own understanding of horror. Now, I did a video probably about a year ago about the Aristotelian idea of comedy, because we still have Aristotle's writings on comedy, and these are 2,400 years old, and they are still relevant today. And what he talks about is that comedy is a type of the absurd, and the absurd is a type of the grotesque. Now, I would say that comedy is the absurd. Horror would be the grotesque. Now, both of these things are dependent upon the Aristotelian idea that there is a standard, a principle. In Aristotelian terms, it is the true, the good, and the beautiful. These things exist, and it is the subversion of these things that bring about the absurd and the grotesque. This is exactly what grotesque means. It is the misshaping of something, and this is what happens in both comedy and horror. So, very likely, what comedy is about is that all of us understand innately, because of the structure of reality and the structure of the reality of a human being and his human nature, we all understand instinctually what the true, the good, and the beautiful are. But when we're confronted all of a sudden with something that is absurd, that is to say, something that is twisting around the true, the good, and the beautiful, we have this instinctual, guttural reaction to this, and it is one, really, of ridicule. It is, at the same time, ridiculing the person who believes these things or puts these things forth, but it's also ridiculing ourselves to some extent in the fact that, look, I got so close to this thing, and I was believing it up until this point, and then it got turned on its head. I'm ridiculing myself and the person who told me this because I'm being confronted all of a sudden with this absurd thing that I know and realize all of a sudden is absurd, is a twisting of what actually is. And the thing about horror, again, it is a step further than comedy, because for comedy, it is something that doesn't really have that much of an impact on you and your existence. But for horror, but for the grotesque, it is something that impacts your life significantly. And this is where I want to bring in the later Augustinian idea of what fear and sadness are. For Augustine, who is always talking about the will, he says that fear is a volition of aversion from the things that we do not wish to happen, and sorrow is a volition of aversion from the things that have happened against our will. So at the center of the ideas of both of these individuals, Aristotle and Augustine, there's an idea that, again, there is a standard truth. There is a standard of reality and human reality. And what humans wish to do is to become fulfilled. What we want to do is to take our position in life and to make it better. Because we realize that the world we live in is broken and that we ourselves are broken, so we want to repair ourselves and make our lives better and better. And this is shown very much in in Augustine's idea of what a lie is. He says that as a human being, we always act out of our own self-interest. We always have an act of the will when we wish to make our lives better, because no one ever engages in a thing knowing that it will make his life worse. Even a madman wouldn't do so. The madman doesn't understand reality well enough to avoid its pitfalls, but everyone acts in their own self-interest to take their station in life and make it better. But the thing is that reality is the great leveler. Reality is the great test. When you act according to what you believe to be true, if it is in fact in accord with the truth, then that willing will actually play out and your station in life will become better. But if you act in accord with a lie is something that is contrary to what is, contrary to reality. And so when you act in a way in order to make your situation better, you end up actually making your situation worse. Because again, it is proved wrong by the great leveler of reality. And so going back to the definitions of fear and sadness, these are the things that horror are based upon. We as human beings wish to make our situation better, but we see things, grotesque things, things that are not in accord with reality, things that will take us away from fulfilling our purpose in life, and we will ourselves to move deliberately away from them. This is fear, and when they befall us and we can't escape that, that brings about horror, that brings about sorrow. So, just like with Aristotle, we shrink back from these things, we fear these things that will actually take away from us. These grotesque things, these things that are not in accord with reality. We wish to flee away from them, to get away from them. And this is usually what happens in a horror story. You see these people, and you think, you need to get away from this thing. You feel for them, and you want them to move away from it. You're trying to some extent, will them to move away from this thing, which you know, but they don't know, is actually going to impact them in a very negative way. Now, just a little side note here, most modern horror actually deals with life and death, because many modern ideas are based upon the fact that there is no other fulfillment besides living. There is nothing but living, and that's it. But really, I would say true horror goes much deeper than that, goes deeper into the things that are more than just your life. They go into the ideas, like Plato would say, that he who thinks that life is the greatest good, and that a person should do anything to serve that ends, well, they are dishonoring themselves to a great degree, because they're ignoring a greater part of their existence, which is their soul. So whereas in the physical existence, you need to fear those things that will end your physical existence, those are pretty finite things. But if you think you have an immortal soul, and you have something that is threatening the existence of that, which is going to cause eternal pain and suffering, well, that you need to get away from infinitely more. That you need to flee away from. That you need to be afraid of. That is horror. And to show you what I mean by all of this, I want to talk about my favorite horror story just for a second. My favorite horror story is Bram Stoker's Dracula. Not any treatment of it, the actual book, Bram Stoker's Dracula. Now, I didn't read this book for a long time because I thought it was actually about Dracula. I thought it was about this monster, this villain, and why would I want to read this book? But after I read it for the first time, which is probably about 20 years ago now, I found it wasn't actually about this monster. It was about these people, these band of friends who had gathered together to fight against this monster. These are a group of people who never would have been friends otherwise, who are thrown into this extreme circumstance and made friends by this monster, and they're fighting of it, and they become the best of friends. Friends that would give their lives for each other. And you become afraid for these group of friends. You don't want these group of friends to break up. Yes, they've been drawn together by fighting this monster, but they will never break apart unless they die. And that's the thing. You are afraid for them. And there is the scene where Quincy dies, and Quincy is the one who knits all of these people together. Not that they wouldn't be friends without Quincy afterwards, but Quincy is a character that adds something to their friendship that can never be replaced once he is gone. It is something that knits them together in a much deeper way. And so you fear for the fact that each of these characters might get killed by this horrific evil. And when it actually does happen, it's a horrible thing, because they lose something within this friendship. They lose something within the fulfillment which is brought about by this friendship. This, to me, is true horror. And the reason I bring that up is because, again, we go back to the ideas of Aristotle and Augustine and Plato. They talk about a standard, a principle, the true, the good, and the beautiful. They talk about things that you need to serve. Again, they realize that you're going to act in your self-interest and want to be fulfilled. But how do you actually become fulfilled? Well, each of them has a slightly different path, but each of them says that you become fulfilled in serving something other than yourself. If you serve a friendship, that is something greater than yourself, something outside of yourself. If you serve the true, the good, the beautiful, this is something, a standard, an objective standard outside of yourself that you serve. And you, even though you are being self-serving in your own fulfillment, you can only be fulfilled by serving something outside of yourself. And here's where we get into this podcast and what these people are talking about. Because if you take all that and turn it upside down, this is exactly what these quote-unquote progressive people at Marvel think that horror actually is. Now, even I have to remind myself every time I listen to one of these podcasts, I have to remind myself that these people live in bizarro world. When you listen to what they have to say, it seems a little bit reasonable at first. You can agree with some of the things that they have to say. But the more and the more that you listen to these people, it becomes evidently clear that everything is turned upside down for them. They believe that up is down, they believe that black is white, they believe that evil is good. And so you have these people, and they're talking about horror, they're talking about fear, and they're using the basic same structure that I'm talking about. They're looking for fulfillment. But where do these progressive people see fulfillment coming from? Well, they see fulfillment as coming from selfishness, because they don't believe in any objective standard whatsoever. There is nothing outside of themselves that can be pinned down and say, this is the truth, or this is something that is real. You can't pin that down for a progressive. Everything is in flux. Therefore, the only thing that they can know is the self. Therefore, if they wish to be fulfilled, the only way that they can be fulfilled is through selfishness. And this is really the heart of progressivism itself. And this is exemplified in this podcast because, of course, these people, they are seeking to be fulfilled. But their fulfillment comes from selfishness. And you will be able to see that because they give you a window into what they fear, what they will themselves to move away from so that they can protect what they think is true, even though, of course, they don't admit to anything being true to begin with. But that right there is the central hypocrisy of progressivism, which keeps coming up time and time again. Now, to give you just a slight background of the three women that are in this podcast. Each of them is an editor for Marvel, and they talk about their job, and it has to do with a lot of small things, but they also have an impact on the storytelling which they are in control of. And the way that they direct this storytelling is towards progressivism. We can see this straight out within the podcast itself. And there's certainly no mystery why they're doing that. The head of Marvel Comics, once again, is Sana Amanat, although some people have hinted at the fact that she might not be there anymore, which I'm going to have to look into. But she, as the head of Marvel, as the head of content and character development, is heavy progressive. And I have gone through this in many videos. But again, we have three editors here that are working for Marvel. And what do they talk about? Well, they talk about things like a book that they are working on called Marvel's Indigenous Voices. They talk about, and I quote, decentralizing the white perspective. And when they talk about horror, the horror that they are interested in is horror that comes from things like xenophobia. Now, I would say that xenophobia would actually be a good thing within horror, because xenophobia is the fear of the unknown, the fear of the stranger. Isn't that something you want in a horror? Because you have these stupid people in horror comics or stories or movies or anything else, and they do these stupid things because they have no fear of what they should be afraid of to begin with, and they end up getting killed, or they end up getting tortured, or something horrible like that. But no, these three editors think that xenophobia and racism, of course, is something that is the basis of horror. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. One of the other things they spend 5 minutes talking about is a thing called eco-horror. And let me just read for you their definition of what eco-horror is, because one of them says we should define this for the people who are not familiar with this term. This is what one of them says, and I can't tell which because they all sound exactly the same. But one of them says, what is eco-horror? It deals with the grief of what we're going through with our planet being under attack and with it being polluted everywhere. I think people are realizing that, we've known about climate change for more than 50 years. We've known what was coming. The companies that pollute the earth know what was happening and continue to do it intentionally. And that disconnect between we know the truth and yet we are continuing on this path, it has created this such odd mentality for our generation. And so now you have young kids like my aunt. Her kid is having nightmares about the end of the world because they know that climate change is really bad. And it's going to look terrible in the next lifetime. It is an existential dread that is catching up to us, basically. I feel like we've been collecting it in our bodies for so long, and now it's like bursting out because it becomes something that you cannot ignore. Now, there's a couple of things I want to draw out of this right away before I continue on. It's the fact that she talks about climate change and how it is the truth. She says, we know the truth, and yet we are continuing on this path. Now again, this is the hypocrisy of progressivism. They deny truth exists to begin with, and then they start to stick in all of this stuff to say that progressivism is the truth. And the other thing that I want to bring up briefly is that one of the editors says this is the direction that Marvel is probably going to go in the future. Whereas you had in the 60s and 70s and slightly in the 80s, you had in society a fear of radiation, and so all of these characters come from being irradiated in some way or another. She thinks that the future of Marvel is going to be based upon eco-horror. That is, you're going to get all of these characters, these new characters and these new stories based upon the horror of the coming ecological disaster, just like we feared the atom in the 60s and the 70s. So there's that. But I want to bring up one more thing about the horror that they see within Marvel Comics. And they are asked, which character do you think portrays horror the best within Marvel Comics? And one of them comes up with the idea that it is She-Hulk. Or at the very least, it should be She-Hulk. That they touched on this in the Immortal She-Hulk, which came out, I think, a month ago. But they need to expand upon this idea very much. Now, when I go into this, it's going to be bizarre. Just listen to what they have to say. They talk about She-Hulk in terms of being a body horror book. Now, I had someone in my comments, I think last week, say, where's all this body positivity that you keep talking about? These are old stories. Marvel doesn't do that anymore. I don't see it anywhere. Well, if you want to look and find it somewhere within current Marvel Comics right now, look at She-Hulk. This is body positivity. She-Hulk is not the beautiful woman that she used to be. She is a man-woman-it thing that is determined by body positivity. And that ties right in with the horror element. So they continue to talk about She-Hulk and how She-Hulk is an agent of rage. They say that She-Hulk is actually a more justified agent of rage than Bruce Banner itself, even though she is more stable than Bruce Banner is. Now let's just talk about that for 1 second. If you look at Bruce Banner, the horror in his past that has caused him emotional pain that makes him into this monster is the fact that he himself was abused by his father as a child, and he watched his mother be abused over and over again. His father beat his mother, and from the very earliest memories that he has, he watched his father beat his mother, and after that he himself got beat by his father, and he had to eventually kill his own father to stop all of this from happening. Now this is a horrible situation that this child was put in, and a horrible existence that this man would have to continue to live through. But these three editors at Marvel think that She-Hulk is more justified in her rage against life than Bruce Banner is because of the horror that she has had to go through. And what is that horror that she has had to go through? It is the patriarchy. And I'm not joking. They don't actually use that word, but they use this sentence. One of them says that her rage comes from her social conditioning for her to be more demure, to be soft, to be feminine. Like I said, this is Bizarro World. These people are insane. They believe that She-Hulk, living in a society where it demands that she be demure and soft and feminine, is a more justified agent of rage than Bruce Banner, who was abused from the time he was a little child and saw his mother abused and had to kill his own father. And, of course, they believe this all results in this body positivity, this body horror of She-Hulk. The reason why she looks like this man-woman it thing now is because this is a manifestation of her rage against the patriarchy. It is a way of her actually saying, I don't agree with that patriarchal structure anymore, therefore I'm going to look like this to make sure I stick it in the face of the people who ask me to be demure and soft and feminine. And again, to these people, this is horror. But I want to distill this down just a little more by reading you a couple of quotes from these, again, 3 editors from Marvel. One of them said about Halloween. She said, I love the traditional feeling of why we do it, Halloween, at that time of year. You know, we're losing light. We're going into a time of darkness and interiority. So it makes sense to sort of indulge those darker urges. Another one says, I love horror, not just the physicality of horror, but the emotional state of it. And she comes back to this point later on in the podcast, talking about the interiority of horror. There's also this exchange between 2 of them talking about superheroes and how it connects to this subject. One says, hopefully, in superhero comics, you get to the end and you get a sense of justice, like something good has come out ultimately, and then you get the catharsis of having gone through this experience and have the emotionals kind of set into you so that you come out feeling sort of washed out, clean. And the other one replies, it's so interesting to see our fears examined and externalized and made both familiar and different so that you can sort of come at it in a new way. And I think your understanding of it and even like your reaction to it changes and shifts. And you get to, again, be scared without having to be in that state. And there's something cathartic about it. And the last quote that I want to give you is another brief exchange. One of them says, what is horror then? You know, reflecting what we see in ourselves in other people. And the other one replies, absolutely. And that does make horror a natural fit for Marvel in a lot of ways, since the core of the best Marvel comics is always a metaphor of some kind. Now, you'll notice from all of these quotes, this internalized feeling message that they keep going on about. One of them says it's a reflection of what we see in ourselves. The other one talks directly about the internalization coming into the external. And another one talks about the emotional state of it and having, as she says, emotionals set into you. So the entire thing is based upon emotion, an emotion that is completely devoid of any connection with reason whatsoever. Again, if we go back to those definitions of Augustine talking about fear, fear is an emotion, but he talks about it as an act of the will in connection with understanding things according to reality. So it does have a connection with reason as an emotion, but these people, no. For them, emotion is this amorphous thing that has no connection to anything outside of itself. This is the entire basis of all they talk about. It is emotion. So again, it is the turning over, the upside down of what I talked about at the first. Whereas in traditional Western society, you talked about fulfillment through this external thing, this thing that is objective that you serve in order for you yourself to be fulfilled. But again, for these people, it's all internal and emotional. It's the service of self through serving self. And you do this through the expression of emotion. And this is where the idea of catharsis comes in that they mention several times in those quotes that I have just read. Now, catharsis, in its original definition, it is a purging of emotions. And it is a purging of emotions in order to get you into a better state. Or at the very least, to get you into a state where you can understand something better. And you can see this when you look at the intense forms of catharsis, where they would put someone in the dark with no connection whatsoever, and they would just have themselves. And they would have to purge themselves through a purging of emotion of all of these superfluous things that were gathered around them so that they were left with the core of who they were and were able to examine that thing as an objective part of themselves. But again, for these people, this catharsis is simply a releasing of emotion, not for something greater, not for service of something greater or the participation in something objective. No, it's the releasing of emotion for the release of emotion itself. And it is this subjectivity which is the basis of all that they think about. So, just for a second, I want to go back and look at the idea of story and connect it with some of the things that they just said. If you look at the traditional way a story is built, the Aristotelian way that story has been declared in Western civilization for thousands of years, it's a representation of reality. So you have a story, and the middle of the story is a standard of reality. It is something objective. But what does the woman, again, an editor at Marvel, think that the center of a story is for Marvel Comics? Well, she says the core of the best Marvel Comics is metaphor. Now, I would agree that metaphor can be used for a good story. Certainly, because if your story is a representation of reality, you want to make it as close to reality as possible, but that's not exactly true. You can't exactly put reality down on the page. Like I talked about in my last video, you want to put people down on the page, but the best you can actually do on the page is characters. You can build up to a point that we build up our own selves, but you can only get as far as character. They can't actually be a person. So you need to fill up some of those holes with things like metaphor. Metaphor certainly can be used as a device to try to explain these things and make it a better representation of reality. But that's not to say that metaphor should become the central part of your entire story. I would say that when you do that, again, it's not an actual story because it's not a true representation of reality. Certainly not in the way that they are talking about. And this comes back to something I'm always talking about, that when these people, these progressive people, write a character, it's not actually a character, it's an idea in a mask. And I don't mean a superhero mask. I mean that it is an idea presented to you as if it were a person, or in other words, it is an idea wearing the mask of a character, but all they're really doing is presenting to you an idea. And this is exactly what she's talking about when she thinks that metaphor is the central point of all of these stories. You see, a story isn't a representation of reality. It itself, just like a character, is an idea that is represented as something else. And of course, what are these ideas that these characters and these stories actually represent? Well, they are ideas of progressivism, of course. So let's try to tie some of this all together by going back to the idea of superhero that they talk about in one of these quotes, and then going from there towards horror. Now, they talk about how superheroes give you a sense of justice at the end. But of course, again, let's look at the way that these people actually view a story and actually view these characters as ideas in a mask. Now, since they talked about She-Hulk, let's go back to a She-Hulk story. A one-page She-Hulk story that was printed in a Marvel comic in the last year. Now, I've put this up on the screen, but if anybody's not watching this, what you have is She-Hulk in this one-page story called Punishment, where She-Hulk, Jennifer Walters, is a lawyer, and she represents this woman, and this woman has an abuser that she is taking to court, and this abuser actually gets convicted. But Jennifer Walters, She-Hulk, and the woman who was abused don't think that his punishment is enough. And so while this man, who has been convicted, while this man is being transported to prison, She-Hulk destroys the transport that he was in, takes him out of the back of this van, and gives him to the woman that he abused so that she herself can dish out more punishment upon this man. And this, in the story, would be a justified punishment. All right, so that's the story. And anyone who is, sane would look at this and say, this is not justice. This is revenge. The whole point of a court system is that it is objective, that you have people in a disimpassioned way apply a punishment to these people in order to rectify justice. You can't give an abuser to the person they abused and have there be an objective standard of punishment doled out that will actually satisfy justice. It just doesn't happen that way. What you're actually looking at is revenge. But of course, this is Bizarro World, and to these progressives, this is justice. Now, how in their right mind can they see this as being justice? Well, for us normal people, we look at it this way. We say, okay, here you have She-Hulk. She's supposed to be a hero, but through her actions, she is doing something villainous, and therefore she is actually a villain, and she is doing something wrong, and therefore this is vengeance, not justice. But if you flip that on its head, as the progressives look at it, they would say the following. She-Hulk is not an actual character. She-Hulk is a representation of an idea. The representation of the idea of right and justification. That is what a superhero is to these people. And I've heard this expressed in many other podcasts. This is exactly what they state over and over again. You have these creative people, and they say they were talking to someone who was a fan of their work. And the statement made to them was, they never felt validated until they saw this character on the page. Now, I always thought of it in terms of identity politics, that they felt validated by this character because they shared the same identity markers. And while that is certainly still there is this other layer where they are feeling validated by this character in the following way. You have a hero. This hero is the representation of good. Therefore, everything that this character does must be good. Therefore, if you have a character like Jennifer Walters, who is doing this as she does in the story, where she is giving this abuser over to his victim so that she can punish him in a more severe way than the courts, well, that's just because Jennifer Walters, the hero, the representation of the idea of justification, is actually doing this, and therefore it is justifying those actions, and in those terms, it is therefore justified. Everything that happens is justified. So they would probably agree that in a different situation, if this was to happen, this would actually be revenge and not be justice in any way. But since they have taken this situation and put it in the hands of the representation of validation and justification itself, which is the superhero, it therefore justifies all of these actions, and therefore this story is a story of justice. You see? Bizarre. They flip everything over. And this is exactly what you see in a lot of comics and a lot of so-called superheroes that you see in Marvel Comics today. Characters like Carol Danvers' Captain Marvel. For most of us, we're looking at her actions and saying, well, she was a hero at one point, then she did these actions, which showed herself to be a villain, and now she's just a villain. But again, for the progressive, they're saying, no, she's a superhero. She's a representation of right and of justification. Therefore, since she's done these things, even though they're horrible things, even to the extent that in a different situation they would be wrong, things like killing Tony Stark, things like creating an illegal gulag to deny the rights of prisoners and hold them there against their will. She's done all of these things, but being a representation of what is right and valid and just, since she did them, they are actually just and right. It's the same thing with the Captain Marvel movie, where the guy comes up and hits on her, and then she crushes his hand, steals his clothes and his bike. Now, of course, for most of us sane people, we look at this and say, that's the act of a villain. But for the progressive, they're looking at it and saying, no, she's a superhero. Therefore, she is the embodiment of validation and justification. Therefore, if she did it, it was actually just. Now with horror, it's slightly different, but has the same basic premise. They don't have a hero to justify what is going on, but they have the person, the reader, actually feeling like they have lived through this experience, and since they have lived through it and come through it so-called stronger, then this is a justification of their ideas. So again, we have these people, these progressives. They think that fulfillment comes from selfishness. This is the ultimate lie of the progressive ideology. Now, for most of us, again, we take reality and we apply it to what we know and see if it's a lie or if it's a reality. But for these people, what they do is they take this lie. And the smarter ones among them know that this lie cannot stand up against reality. So what they do is they put it through a mill of a story that is going to justify it. And this is exactly what happens. Again, because everything in these stories is based upon emotion. The whole progressive story is based upon nothing but emotion. So you have an emotional wrong that happens within the story. And the person who is reading it, the progressive who is reading it, again, they become horrified by it to some extent. They fear it because they fear what is going to detract from what they think will fulfill them. They fear this thing because it is trying to contradict the idea that they can be fulfilled by being selfish. But then they go through the story. And either they have a superhero justify their own ideas at the end, or the characters live through everything that this story can throw at their idea of selfishness being the greatest principle, and they either come through it alive, or at the very least, the reader comes through it alive, and they feel, once again, they feel like they have gone through all of this, and they have weathered the storm of these criticisms that are laid against their progressive lie of selfishness being the fulfilling principle. And since they have lived through it and become stronger, this is the catharsis that they're talking about. They have lived through this expression of emotion which does nothing but justify and strengthen the lie that they told to themselves in the beginning. So for these progressive people, what the stories that they are creating are about, they're not just propaganda to try to emotionally teach others what progressivism actually is, but for they themselves, it is a support mechanism whereby they go through the mill of a false reality to justify their own beliefs, thinking that this reality is an actual representation of true reality. It has thrown everything it can at their lie of selfishness being fulfilling, and this lie has come out at the end unscathed, and therefore their lie must be true. And they get to feel justified by being nothing but selfish. And of course, how does this play out in actual reality? Well, you have these progressives, and since they are so convinced of this lie of selfishness that they can therefore feel empowered to go out into real life and destroy any reality that is based upon the true, the good, and the beautiful. So, if I've given you anything new to think about, hit like, hit the shield in the lower right-hand corner of your screen to subscribe, and leave me a comment. Tell me what you think about all this. And again, don't forget, the link is in the description for the pre-launch page for my coming graphic novel, where you can sign up to be informed when the project goes live, and sign up for a free pinup poster if you later order the book. Alright, I'll see you later. Bye.